San Diegans accomplish great things every day. We care about our neighbors and our community. We are proud of our diversity. We are resilient. We hold our leaders accountable. We live in one of the most dynamic cities in America, the San Diego Union-Tribune, telling San Diego's story for more than 150 years.
Hello, I'm Dr. Gail F. Baker, Vice President and Provost at the University of San Diego.
And I'm Dr. Noelle Norton, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences here at USD.
For the second year in a row, USD, along with its College of Arts and Sciences and Humanities Center, is proud to return as the presenting sponsor for the 2021 San Diego Union-Tribune Festival of Books.
As a university deeply committed to the liberal arts, USD promotes a form of lifelong learning that ignites curiosity, builds critical connections across different ideas and topics by seeing them from unique perspectives.
Our partnership with the Festival of Books enables all of us avid readers to come together as a community alongside renowned authors from all over the world and to dive deeply into imaginative stories and important themes.
Yes, books do have the ability to open minds and hearts. On behalf of the University of San Diego, we thank you for joining us for today's program to explore the world of books with us.
Enjoy the presentation.
Welcome everybody to the San Diego Union-Tribune Festival of Books. I'm Kristy Totten, host of the San Diego Newsfix, and today we have Brit Bennett with us. Brit Bennett is the author of The Vanishing Half. She's a New York Times bestselling novelist, also wrote The Mothers, a finalist for the NBCC John Leonard Prize for the Best First Book, the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize for Debut Fiction, and the New York Public Library Young Lions Award. She is one of the National Book Foundation's 5 Under 5 honorees and has written for The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, The Paris Review, and Jezebel. Brit, thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
I was hoping we could just start with a short excerpt from your book, The Vanishing Half.
Sure. I'll just read a little bit from the opening of the book. The morning one of the lost twins returned to Mallard, Lou LeBon ran to the diner to break the news. And even now, many years later, everyone remembers the shock of sweaty Lou pushing through the glass doors, chest heaving, neckline darkened with his own effort. The barely awake customers clamored around him, 10 or so, although more would lie and say that they'd been there too, if only to pretend that this once they'd witnessed something truly exciting. In that little farm town, nothing surprising ever happened, not since the Vignes twins had disappeared. But that morning in April 1968, on his way to work, Lou spotted Desiree Vignes walking along Partridge Road, carrying a small leather suitcase. She looked exactly the same as when she'd left at 16, still light, her skin the color of sand, barely wet, her hipless body reminding him of a branch caught in a strong breeze. She was hurrying, her head bent, and Lou paused here, a bit of a showman. She was holding the hand of a girl, 7 or 8, and black as tar. Blue black, he said, like she'd flown direct from Africa. I'll probably stop there.
When I first started reading your book, it is set in the past, and it's also set in this town where color is sort of prized among the people who live there. That made me think that I was setting myself up to read something that was almost like fantasy or not set in actual reality. But I have read that it was based on something that you learned about in reality. Can you tell me more about the genesis of the book?
Yeah, the book idea came from my mother, who was from Louisiana originally, and she was telling me about these types of towns that were very obsessed with skin color. And, I grew up in Oceanside, so that was something that felt very mythological to me, I think. It didn't feel quite real either. But when I went to sit down to actually write the book, I did some research. I, stumbled upon historical records of some of these types of communities that existed. And I decided to kind of lean into that feeling of unreality as I was writing the book.
Yeah, so surprising to hear about. Well, your book touched on, so many identity topics, racism, colorism, being transgender. And, when it came out, of course, last year, everyone's like, it's so of the times. And I've heard you say in many interviews, actually, you had been writing it for years before, you weren't really trying to write toward the moment, or were you? I mean, what does it say that, you had been writing it for so long and it still resonates?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can never really know the context that your book is going to emerge into. I never, of course, imagined that my book was going to be published during a global pandemic, for example. So you really have no way of knowing or even having any sense of perspective about that type of thing. So I don't think in that way I was consciously writing towards all of the twists and turns that 2020 would take. But I think, some of the themes that I was interested in are evergreen topics. Like I can't imagine a year where these were not conversations that we were having, whether those were conversations that made the news or that people were like posting on Instagram. That's a different thing. But people have always been interested, I think, in these questions of identity. Like writers of all stripes have always been asking those questions. And in particular, Black writers, I think, have been interested in these questions of race and identity and choice and all of those types of themes. So I think they are evergreen topics, but I think also, of course, the context in which a book emerges, sometimes the book just hits different depending on what the conversations are happening around it.
Yeah, again, grappling with all of those topics, did you personally learn or discover anything, about yourself in the writing of it?
I think what I kept sort of coming up against, I think one was just the absurdity of race, running up against these moments of deep absurdity as I was researching the book and writing it that were continually, I think, surprising in different ways. So I think that was one thing. And then the other thing is just the idea that these topics are so complex and they're often more complicated than the language that we use in the conversations that we have around race or gender or whatever other type of identity category. So for me as a writer, as a person who works in language, then, the question is, well, how do I find a better language that is a more complicated language and that actually speaks to the complexity of identity instead of trying to flatten or simplify it?
Yeah, something it really reminded me in the reading of it was, is it between the world and me, people who believe themselves to be white. Like when I first read that was such a powerful way to describe race, right? Because really when it comes down to it, it is just a belief. I mean, so what are some of the takeaways, in your opinion, from the book about the way that we as a society deal with race?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, there's a way that I kept running against the absurdity of it. The idea that race is a fiction, but racism is a reality, and we have to kind of sit in that tension. And the book is about a woman who passes, and she passes for white because she goes to get a job and somebody assumes that she's white, and she just kind of goes with it. So part of what was so, again, absurd to me was, the idea that race is something that can determine so many material realities of our lives. But at the same time, it's so flimsy that this woman became white just because somebody thought she was, and she decided to go along with their thought. So to me, I think that those were the biggest things was how do I sit in that tension of the fact that there is something so flimsy, or not even flimsy, maybe just fluid and unstable about race, but at the same time, the implications of race can be life or death. And what does it mean that both of those things are true?
What has success been like for you? I know this isn't your first book. Your other one was also critically acclaimed, but I mean, this came out, it skyrocketed to the top of lists. You have an HBO show coming out. You're a household name. You've been on TVs around the country. I mean, was that the goal, or is this, kind of for you as well?
I mean, I don't know about all of that, but no, I mean, I don't think it's the goal. I think that when you are a writer, you just hope that somebody who doesn't know you buys the book. You know that your mom is going to read it or your friends are going to read it, but you're not expecting and at least I was not expecting any of the just the fervor and the enthusiasm for this book. It blew me away in every way. So I think, in a lot of ways, this past the experience of publishing this book has been completely life-changing. And then in other ways, all of this happened while I was in quarantine. So really nothing in my day-to-day life actually meaningfully changed in that sense. I was still inside as all of these things were happening. as exciting as they were, and I'm grateful for them. But also there was kind of that, I think, absurdity too of feeling, more exposed than I had ever felt in my life, but also feeling more isolated and more, just more, as we all have been, just that weird feeling of the book is outside going around the world and I am still in my apartment. That was, I think, the strangest kind of tension for me.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So have you been able to even do a public reading or tour at all, or really you've just been at home since it came out?
Yeah, no tour. I did my first public reading the other day. So that was cool. But yeah, very surreal to think, the book's been out for over a year. And that was the first time I'd signed a book for somebody in public. So yeah, very strange experience. But that being said, I felt so grateful that the book was received so warmly, because I know there were so many great books that came out during quarantine, but because people were not able to tour, were not able to go around talking about them, they didn't get the attention that they deserved.
I want to ask you more about that, but I read on your Twitter, you're like, oh, I saw somebody reading my book in public for the second time. And you described it as kind of humiliating, like seeing somebody just sort of in your thoughts in public.
Yeah.
I don't know if they recognized you, but obviously you saw your book. I mean, will you talk more about that? What does that feel like?
I mean, well, the good thing is that, not that I think that these people would recognize me, but I was wearing a mask, so that made me feel a little bit less embarrassed. But yeah, I mean, that's never happened to me. My first book came out in 2016. I had never seen someone just out in public with the book. And this happened to me twice in Brooklyn, where I was just walking down the street. And the first time I was with a friend who was like, let's go say hi. I was trying to very much embarrass me. But, it's a strange feeling. Of course, it's very surreal to, again, see your book out in the world in a very tangible way, where you're not at a bookstore, you're not at a book event, you're just like walking down the street. So there's a way that is something that's really surreal. And I think, the more existential thing is that, I'm passing somebody on the street who doesn't know who I am, who does not know that they're reading my book, but they, in a way, have access to me. That's, and that's what happens every time you write a book. But I had never, I think, experienced that in life outside of, this person came to my reading, or this person, came to a book festival or something. So just to pass some, a girl on the street where I live who's holding the book against her chest, I mean, that's both like a really, deep honor, but also there is something that just made me want to like scream and run away. So it's a strange feeling.
Yeah. So you didn't walk up and sign it, I take it.
I absolutely did not. I didn't. No.
Well, you mentioned some books that came out in quarantine, and because we were in quarantine, didn't get the publicity or notice they may have deserved. I mean, was there anything, that came out during that time, or anything that you read during that time that, was really impactful to you?
Yeah, there were a lot of things that I read that I really liked. I mean, one book was the book Actress by Anne Enright, which I thought was really great. I think it came out some point in the spring or maybe slightly before. And that was a book that I really loved, that I loved reading. And as far as other things, there are a lot of things that I'm reading now that have not yet come out. So I'm hoping that for these authors that we will hopefully be able to do in-person events then, so they can get the experience of having the tour and all of that. But there was another book, Open Water by Caleb Nelson, that I also really enjoyed, that came out kind of this year. So there are a bunch of different books I read throughout the space, but I think I particularly feel for debut writers who, that's such an exciting moment for me when my first book came out, to get to see my friends and family at these events and to have that moment of public celebration after so many years of private work. So I feel for the writers who haven't had that experience, at least in the real world. And I hope that they will, as we hopefully get more vaccinated and people can go to live events.
Absolutely. I know it was big news that The Vanishing Half is being made into an HBO series. There's this big bidding war. They won. You're going to be involved. Can you just give us an update? Where does that process stand? And how will you be involved?
I will be involved as an executive producer. So I'm not writing it, but I'm involved on the producing side of weighing in and giving feedback. And we're still early on. We're still working on the draft. So we're still early on in the writing process, but it's been really exciting so far. We have a great team put together. And it's fun to imagine how this book is going to be transformed into a whole different medium.
Yeah, how is, TV writing or writing for the screen, different than what you've been doing, writing novels?
I think it's a really different animal, to be honest. And I think to me, the biggest thing that's the most shocking thing so far on the TV side is just how collaborative it is. You know, you write a novel by yourself in a room. And with the TV show, there's so many more people, whether it's the writer's room, whether it's all the producers, whether it's all the people at the studio, everybody's giving feedback. It's just a very different way of storytelling. But I think that's part of what is exciting to me is kind of see the machinery work in that way that's very different than how I'm used to working, which is a way that's very solitary.
Do you have a cast in place yet, or any other news you want to break at the Festival of Books?
No, we're not that far in the process yet. No talk about casting. I think they're just trying to get the screenplay written.
Okay. I have some questions about your process. So you are born and raised in Oceanside, and at least part of the book happens in the South, in Louisiana, also spanning time from the 60s to the 70s to the 80s. I mean, how do you prepare for that as a writer? What kind of research goes into it?
I think it was a blend for me. I mean, part of it because my mother's family is from Louisiana. There was part of the book that I drew from her stories about growing up there. And then there are other parts that I drew from the reading that I did. I knew that I was writing this book that was taking place in places where I had not lived or had not grown up and at time periods in which I was not alive. So I knew that I was writing into the void in a lot of different ways. So a lot of it was either drawing on conversations with family members or research, reading books about the history of race in Louisiana, reading books about the sort of specific times and places that I was working about, or reading writers who were writing in those times and places, in order to try to make the book feel grounded in that type of reality.
Wow. Yeah, that sounds like a lot of work. What were some of the authors you read to sort of prepare, for this undertaking?
Yeah, there were different books. I remember I read this book called A Chosen Exile by Allison Hobbs, which is about the history of racial passing. So that was one of the first books that I read to kind of think about racial passing. Why did people do this? What was that experience like for them? So that was a book that was really helpful for me in that way. And then there were also other novels that I was reading about passing. Of course, Passing by Nella Larson. There's a great book called Caucasia by Danzy Senna, which is about passing and sisterhood. So that book was a really interesting book to think about, to kind of connect me to some of the themes in this novel. So it was different. It was a blend of fiction and nonfiction in order to, speak to some of the different subjects and themes in the book. But I think they were all helpful in various ways.
So The Vanishing Half jumps around. It's sort of nonlinear. The first section is 1968, then I believe it's 1978, then it goes back to 1968, then to the 80s. Do you write those chronologically, or do you write them the way that we end up reading them?
That's a good question. I think more or less the order that it's in the book. I don't think I wrote it chronologically, but I also didn't expect it to do all the jumping when I first started. I thought it would start in 1968 and just go. But I realized that I wanted to tell the story in a way that was kind of disjointed. And I realized that it was fun to kind of reorient the reader in a different decade or different place. And the reader would have to be like, okay, now we're in New York in the early 80s. Okay, now we're in LA in the 70s. I had fun doing that. So I think it was I mostly wrote it in the order that you all saw it, but there were definitely pieces that moved around as I was working on it. It took a while for me to figure out how to tell the story in a way that felt right to me, but also would make sense to the reader.
Mm-hmm. What is the process like for you for writing a book? It's like, as a journalist, I'll write an article that's like a few hundred words and I want to nitpick it to death and never let it go. So I can't even imagine, taking this text that's several thousand words and how do you finally just let it go? Or what is the process?
I mean, I definitely feel that way too. I think a lot of the process, it's not it's not an exciting response, but I think a lot of the process is the people that I have around me who sometimes have to yank it from me. So I think you need people around you to tell you when it's ready or when it's done. And I think there's also for me, I remember having a writing professor who said, no novel is perfect. You cannot achieve perfection in the novel. It's just impossible to do. And I'm sure there are lots of people, and I also have some objections of things that I believe to be perfect novels, but that to me was a helpful thing to keep in mind as I'm working, which is just Like, it's never going to be perfect. You're never going to think it's perfect. Even, if other people think it's perfect, you probably won't. So for me, I think the moment where I know I'm ready to move on is when I feel like I've reached the end of myself, where it's like, this is the most I can do with this. Because you can only write the best book that you can write at that time. So that I think a lot of that, at least that's how I try to navigate that. But yes, if it were up to me, I would still be editing The Vanishing Half. So I think a lot of it is having people around you who tell you, like, it's time to let it go.
Do you reread your writing once it's published, looking for ways to improve it, or just, to appreciate it? Or do you sort of let it go until look back?
No, I mean, when I have to do readings, that's when you have to kind of revisit it in that way. But even then, like, when I would do readings in public, I usually, like, for the mothers at least, I had a copy of the book, and in the copy of the book that I had, I was like editing sentences before I went to read them out loud. So yeah, I don't reread for pleasure, but when I have to read things, then you kind of revisit it. But sometimes I will, like, if I encounter something, especially for the mothers, because that book came out so long ago, sometimes I'll encounter people will post like a quote from the book or something, and it feels really destabilizing. It feels like somebody else wrote the book. It doesn't feel like you want over. I imagine I'll feel that way about this book too in some time. Like, after a while, you're so far away from the person who was working on it every single day that it feels like a stranger wrote it.
So you said you do believe there are perfect novels. What are they?
I mean, I think there aren't many, but I think, the first thing that came to mind was, like, Beloved is a perfect novel. Like, there's certain, like, books where I'm just like, yes, this book is flawless. But I think, and also I don't know that perfection should even be the goal of any artist. Like, I don't even know that perfect art is necessarily the most interesting. Because I think that's what the teacher was also saying, that a lot of times the thing that is flawed about the book is what actually makes it more interesting than like this perfect object. But I think if I had to, like, cast a vote, I would say that Beloved is a perfect novel. But at the same time, I think perfection is overrated.
It's a very good book. So, I wanted to ask you about the relationship between Stella and Kennedy in the book. Stella is the white passing sister that goes to live in Los Angeles and raises a daughter, who believes herself to be white. That really kind of reminded me of like an immigrant and their child relationship. It's like, I did this for you so you could have a better life, and you're just, a spoiled American and you don't appreciate it. But it was interesting because Stella couldn't or wouldn't, say that to her daughter. I mean, how did you write that? And also, is that something you feel like you have experience with?
Yeah, I mean, I have my best friend's parents are from Kenya, and he read it in the same way, and read Stella's journey as like this assimilation journey. And I think that that's not something, my parents are not immigrants, so that wasn't something that I was I think immediately thinking about in the moment, but I do like that reading. And I think it's an interesting reading for the character. I think as far as writing that dynamic, I wanted to think about just the complexity of this relationship because, as you said, because of all the things that have to go unsaid between these two people. It's a very different relationship, I think, if Kennedy knows her mother's life story just from the beginning. But I started to think about what it would be like to be Kennedy, where you don't understand why your mother is so frustrated with you, and you don't understand why she, seems to resent you. You don't understand these dynamics of the relationship. And, for Stella, like, I understood why Stella was frustrated with her daughter, but also, it felt very unfair for me as I was writing it. Felt unfair for her to blame her daughter in a sense for the choices that she made. So it was a very complicated mother-daughter relationship, but I liked that reading of it, this reading of Stella's journey as being this very extreme, sort of assimilation narrative, because she really is like, she ends up, in a sense, in this whole other sort of white country. She ends up in this different world. She has to learn to speak the language. She has to learn the culture. She has to learn the traditions. Like, she has to do those types of things. And there are ways in the book moments where you see that she has like correctly assimilated, and other moments where she has not. And you see what the penalties for that are.
Yeah, another kind of universal theme I noticed is like Jude, Desiree's daughter, ends up better off in many ways, right? Even though Stella and other people around them believe, oh, your life might be better if you're more light skinned. She's very dark skinned and very successful. She has a happy love life. She has a career that's sort of blossoming. Was there a message there, or what were you thinking of when you wrote it?
I mean, I think for that, I thought about, I didn't want to apply some type of value judgment, particularly for the cousins. Like, I didn't want to say, Kennedy is going to end up, punished in some way. Her life is really bad or sad, and Jude's life is good. And, I didn't want to have that type of value judgment. But I liked the idea of seeing Jude go out into the world and leave behind this sort of social construct that she's been born into. She's been born, or not born into it, but she grows up in this town that has tried to teach her to hate herself. And once she is able to leave that place, what she's able to do and who she's able to be. So a lot of that I think was really interesting to me. And then I think Kennedy, on the other hand, is someone who's also kind of in this constant questioning of who she is. And you see that with her, but I didn't want to apply a value judgment of either of them, of one of them has like a great life and one has a terrible life. I just wanted to think of who these women are, how they think of themselves, and how their upbringing and their relationship with their family has shaped that.
What have you heard from readers? I mean, I think, this is a fictional book, but it is very relatable to, a lot of people. I mean, have people related to it?
I think so. I mean, I've heard from a lot of people who have told me about their very complicated family stories, lots of stories about relatives who have passed. I've heard from some people who've had just estranged relationships with family members, and this book made them think about that. I heard a lot of readers about their experiences with color. So I've heard a lot from readers in these different ways who have related to one or more aspects of the book. So it's been really surprising, I think, to see how deeply people have connected to this story emotionally.
What is something just non-book related at all that you're really into right now?
Well, I definitely got very deeply into podcasts during the quarantine. And I think in part, it just became really comforting to hear people's voices, like to hear people talking to you. So those are things I'm into. I have my whole lineup every week of what I listen to. So yeah, I mean, I love You're Wrong About, which is kind of like a sort of debunking podcast where they talk about culture and history. There's a podcast called Spinsters that I really love, which is two female journalists talking about basketball. So that podcast is great. There's one called Maintenance Phase that's about sort of health and diet culture and wellness. So I'm really into, I got more into podcasts. Before, I think I listened to maybe one or two. And now I truly have my lineup, and I wait for them to update every week. So when I'm on the train or when I'm walking around, I have something to listen to.
Awesome. That makes me happy to hear. I'm going to check out your recommendations. I guess just a couple final questions. We're running low on time here, but you sort of had not a nonlinear path, but you didn't always think you would be a writer. You went to Stanford thinking that you might be a lawyer. You ended up, it was just something you loved. It was obvious it would happen. But I mean, what is your, advice for other aspiring writers out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best advice that I have heard and have tried to follow, I think one is just reading widely. Reading whatever is interesting or exciting to you. There were so many books that I read in writing The Vanishing Half that did not seem like they would have anything to do with this book, but inspired it in one way or another, or led me to think of something or imagine something differently. So I think that's one thing, is just reading widely and learning from whatever you're reading. And I think the other thing is just being patient with yourself, because the work is bad for so much longer than it's ever good. And so much of writing a novel, I think in particular, is having to sit with that, to sit with the fact that you will feel bad about your work for years as you're working on it. And then hopefully you get to that point where you feel good about it. But sometimes that doesn't even happen. Sometimes you still are have the finished copy of your book and you're editing it, So I think learning to be patient with yourself and understanding that sometimes that's part of the process, but you can't beat yourself up. You have to just kind of put your head down and keep working. I think those are pieces of advice that I try to keep in mind as I work.
Yeah, such an important reminder. So what are you working on now, and when do we get our next Brit Bennett book?
I don't know about that last part. But yeah, I'm working on my third novel now. So I'm still pretty early on, but it's been exciting to jump into a different fictional world.
Okay. Brit Bennett, author of The Vanishing Half, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
I want to mention our booksellers. You can purchase Brit Bennett's books from our indie bookseller partners at bookshop.org/shop/SDFOB. Please consider supporting the San Diego Council on Literacy by visiting literacysandiego.org. And you can continue to join us for the full program of author panels, exciting demonstrations, and live entertainment streamed online entirely. The videos will be available at sdfestivalofbooks.com. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you, Brit.